Dr. David Ash. Dave is a senior risk analyst with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission with over 20 years of experience in performance assessment. Prior to joining NRC, he worked at Argonne National Lab on wasteform development. David is also one of the youngest dual recipients of NRC's highest and the second highest awards. So congratulations. He's a proponent of probabilistic analysis, simulation modeling, and assessment of uncertainty. He has made many contributions, including high-profile projects such as Yucca. David has 4 degrees, including a PhD in engineering from Penn State. Maybe a little bit of reaction time.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, Ming. Yes, I'm David Ash. I'm here representing a team to talk to you about the Hanford Sea Tank Farm performance assessment and our review of the draft waste incidental to reprocessing evaluation. My colleagues are Hans Alt, who is actually the technical lead for this review, and Lloyd DeSotel, who's the main project manager. Chris McKenney is here in the audience. He's my branch chief and Hans's branch chief of what's the newly named Risk and Technical Analysis branch, who used to be the Performance Assessment branch. So I'm going to do a little bit of overview on what is waste incidental to reprocessing. I wasn't sure if all the audience would be familiar with it. I know many of you would be, but some of you may not be. So just a little bit on waste incidental to reprocessing, what it's all about. The criteria, so what are we reviewing to? And then how does the review process work? And then I wanted to go over some technical considerations and concluding remarks. So here's my disclaimer, because this is ongoing. We aren't making any conclusions at this time. So this is basically how do I spend 25 minutes talking to you without saying anything? So when we're done, hopefully you'll get some useful information out of it. I participated in all the early community of practice meetings, and I always found them valuable. I learned things every time, and that's why I like going to them. Although now I think we should call them the Ming Dynasty, though, perhaps. So what is waste incidental to reprocessing? It's waste that otherwise would be high-level waste based on its origin, but can be managed as low-level waste because of the level of risk it poses. The picture here, I think, I love all these old pictures. It's a great picture. It shows the scale and enormity of the problem that you're dealing with, okay? So these tanks are very large. You can see the rebar here. There's an enormous amount of iron that goes into the structure to make it. And then they have various different levels of, or different types of materials that are used to construct them. A lot of cement, but a lot of other things. It's not just a simple block of concrete when it's done. It's a much more complicated system than that. And then in addition, what ends up inside the tank can be fairly complex, especially at Hanford, where it was operated for a long time and many different campaigns and different types of waste were generated. Those were mixed and processed and sent between tanks, and you end up with a very complex waste in the tanks. So it's a very challenging task to then remove this and then assess the risk from what might remain. Hopefully just a thin layer of waste in the bottom and maybe a little bit of material attached to the sides of the tanks. What is our role at Hanford? So Hanford is not part of the 2005 National Defense Authorization Act that established a more formal role for NRC for review of waste incidental to reprocessing evaluations at the Savannah River site here and at Idaho, okay? For those, we have a monitoring role. So we'll do a review, and then after the review is done, NRC has a monitoring role, which is basically a follow-through and oversight role that we continue interfacing with the Department of Energy and maybe evaluating uncertainties that couldn't be resolved in the course of the review as more information is collected after that initial review is done. At Hanford, we just have a consultation type role, but they are fairly similar. So it starts off with scoping meetings and technical exchanges. That's what we're doing right now. We have actually a call this afternoon, which I will miss, but my coworkers will be on. And then one on Thursday. Those are publicly noticed. Anybody can call in and listen if you'd like. And we talk about a whole variety of technical topics associated with the reviews. I think this week might be some saturated zone issues that we carried over, and then maybe cover and infiltration, I think. Okay. Oh, sorry, one other thing. So, sorry, we start off with our scoping meetings or technical exchanges. Eventually, we produce a request for additional information, RAI. That is currently scheduled to be done basically the end of November. And so there's tentatively a meeting scheduled for potentially December 5th out in Washington, where we'll go over this with the Department of Energy. It's kind of a, do you have any questions about what the questions we're asking you? Eventually, DOE would respond to those requests for additional information, and if we can get everything resolved, we issue a technical evaluation report. So that's where we kind of say, okay, we agree with you, we don't agree with you, here's some assumptions, here's things to follow through on, that sort of thing. This is our contacts in case you want to talk to any of us about this particular review. Lloyd, Maurice is his backup, Hans and myself are the main technical reviewers. Steve Koenig is the low-level waste branch chief. That branch's name has changed a little bit too. And then Chris McKenney, who's in the audience, our risk and technical analysis branch chief. And all these extensions here are in the form 301, 415, et cetera. Call us, email us, whatever, if you want to talk about it. So the criteria we used, in this case at Hanford, we're following DOE Manual 435.1. So it removed key radionuclides to the maximum extent practical or technically and economically practical. And please see the manual itself for the specific language. These are a bit summarized. Disposal to meet performance objectives of or comparable to what's in our low-level waste regulations. DOE Manual 435.1-1 also has alternative requirements for waste identified as transuranic waste. And then the waste is stabilized in a solid physical form. So that's kind of the summary of the criteria that we review. So what is reviewed? Well, Hanford is an interesting site that it's been around a long time, and the information is voluminous. So there's something like 4 million documents associated with the site. It's an enormous number. They have a lot of them. Their document management system, I would say, is pretty good. A lot of them we can find. If we can't find them, the people that we've been working with have been super responsive to making documents available to us. But there are boxes and boxes and probably even warehouses of documents, historical ones that have been saved that are not available. So the level of information is enormous. So I guess if we have 3 people reviewing it and there's 4 million documents, we each get 1.3 million repeating to review. So I guess maybe I should be reviewing about 500 documents during this 30 minutes is the scope of it. But it's a little mind-boggling. And my home office is right inside the front door of my house. I have 6 computers in there because I do distributed processing. But my wife is very annoyed because she made me clean up my office, and then I started working on Hanford, and now it's all documents all over the place. So it looks like a disaster area in here. We conduct a completeness review, which we already did for Hanford. We issued some comments on that. And then we review the waste evaluation document, which is the main one generated to describe the WEIR criteria and why DOE thinks they met them. And then we review supporting documents, first level, secondary, tertiary, as down as you go. And so it's kind of a pyramid, if you think about it, where the waste evaluation document and the performance assessment are here at the top. And then you go down and the documentation just gets enormous, especially for a large project like Hanford that's been around a long time. That, like I said, 4 million documents. I guess I didn't think about the math. If we start with 2 here, what the multiplier needs to be for each level, or how many levels you have. But anyway, we review the performance assessment model and the incorporated assumptions, the supporting calculations, and the support for those models. We may develop independent models to develop risk insights. We didn't have a lot of time for this Hanford Waste Management Area C review, partly because we had started it, and then there were some funding issues, and then the funding came back. But we actually did take a simple performance assessment model we had for another purpose and modified it to be able to get some insights for the Hanford review. And that's, as a regulator, that's very helpful because I'm a fly fisherman, and so when you go fly fishing and you want to see what's hatching, one thing you can do is like turn over the rocks in the stream and see what's under the, what the aquatic life is. Well, that's kind of what the regulator does with their own independent model, is you're turning over those rocks and trying to learn where the problems are. What do I need to ask about and why? Because with the project so huge, you can't ask about everything. It may seem that way to the Department of Energy, that we are asking about everything, but we really aren't asking about everything. We're asking about select topics that we think could affect the decision. This is an overview of performance assessment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. You can look at this figure, and it's similar to what was talked about in the previous talk. There is this kind of iterative process here in the beginning, or in the center of it, that it is a learning process. You're trying to understand your system. And I always tell people, whether you're the regulator or whether you're the person that developed the assessment, if you can understand the model in your head without running the model, at least kind of anticipate what it's going to produce for different simulations, then you're where you need to be. If you're surprised many times by what your model produces, or you can't explain the output of your model, then you're not quite where you need to be in terms of understanding your performance assessment. It involves a conceptual model. I may have used up my pointer here. The conceptual model up in the upper right, and then that conceptual model, site conceptual model, is converted into a numerical model. And so we review the aspects of the conceptual model, the completeness of it, and then the implementation of the numerical model. So how is it reviewed? We use this New Reg 1854 and a variety of other documents. Here's our document management system number at the bottom here. Our Adams is our document management system. It sure helps if you have the document number to find anything in it. Otherwise, maybe Google might be a better choice. I didn't say that, but we use this to guide our review, and it provides our areas of review and review procedures. I was one of the main authors of this document, so I take full responsibility for its content, good or bad. I do not take responsibility for the fact that it is still draft final report for interim use, and it's issued by an office that no longer exists on the bottom down there. So here's some select technical considerations. This is where maybe I'll say something actual instead of saying something without actually saying something. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the hybrid performance assessment approach, quality assurance, risk-informed review, and then addressing RAIs with model simulations. So hybrid performance assessment, this is something the DOE has been using on a lot of their waste incidental processing sites. It's basically combining a deterministic and possibly higher fidelity process models, the results from that, which is usually used to generate a base case or a deterministic base case result, combined with sensitivity analysis. And then in parallel, developing a system model, such as with software platform like GoldSim, to do the full probabilistic modeling and uncertainty analysis. And they say improved understanding of role of uncertainties and implications on system performance, which is probably true. But as most things in life, there are no free lunches. So on the regulatory side, when we look at this hybrid approach, there are some challenges associated with it. So the hybrid approach generally results in additional review effort and can decrease transparency if you aren't careful. And that's because you're using this more complex process level model that may not be transparent. It may be more of a black box. You're combining that with possibly other models or other model results. Maybe you need to do manual steps to take output from one model and put it into another. That's a source of error. Maybe they're fully integrated, but they run very slow, right? And so even though I have a distributed computer system in my office, it's not a supercomputer. And sometimes these models can get very slow, depending on the dimensionality and the processes being simulated and that sort of thing. So then the regulator, at least for NRC, we like to verify, do our own independent verification of results that people submit to us to make sure we understand them and that they're correct. Well, that can be difficult if we don't have a computer system to run it, or the thing runs so slow that we can't develop the insights that we would like to develop. There can be a challenge that the sensitivity cases, if you aren't careful, with the deterministic model may not communicate the importance of uncertainty. I'll talk a little bit about that in a little more detail. And then it must be demonstrated that the abstractive models are valid. So if we go back there to the abstraction in the middle, we support abstraction. We believe it's a necessary part of doing numerical modeling and simulation modeling. And the abstraction is basically you take your higher fidelity detailed process model and you do some simplified representation of what it's producing. It could be a lookup table, it could be a more simplified model, it could take a variety of different forms, but you do have to show that your abstractions are representing that more complex model. And then also with numerous uncertainties, the deterministic base case represents one possible result out of a large output space. So that can be a challenge too. If the deterministic base case is well supported and you can demonstrate that it's conservative, as that term likes to be used. I like to use pessimistic because conservative implies you know the answer. Pessimistic implies you're trying to go in the right direction. If you can demonstrate that it's conservative and well supported, then the deterministic base case approach is fine. And that generally is fine for simple problems and with less uncertainties. But most of the problems we're dealing with here in DOE space are at the other end of the spectrum. They tend to be large and complex with a lot of things going on. Quality assurance. Oh, everybody loves quality assurance, right? So quality assurance is very important to the regulator because we're essentially relying on numerical modeling to make these estimates of public health, protection of public health and safety. So you have to demonstrate that the results are correct. It's an essential requirement of anything that you're doing. If the regulators start seeing problems with the surface level of your output, then they start getting very nervous about what might be going on underneath the surface for these very complex analyses with lots of things going on. The propensity to make mistakes goes up with the complexity of the problem you're evaluating and the ways that you're evaluating it. And then in addition to that, it doesn't matter what the results are if you didn't adequately support them. You can say, oh, well, I calculated this number and it's well below the criteria. But if you didn't demonstrate that the result is believable or why it should be believed or why it can be supported, then it doesn't matter that the result is much below the criteria. It applies to everything that you do, starting from the data, the propagation of it through the models, all the modifications and transformations, the software, and the actions taken to develop and create these items. And I should say that compared to some other licensee, or DOE is not a licensee, but compared to licensees we deal with, the DOE's quality assurance tends to be on the better end of the spectrum. We see some, very poor quality assurance at times for things that are submitted to us. A quality assurance review prior to submitting it to a regulator or reviewer may reduce regulatory burden, right? If you can have somebody, whether it's internally or you hire a contractor or something, do that sort of review before you give it to the regulator, I don't know what the cost benefit is, but my guess is you would save yourself a lot of money. So this is probably the most important slide for you to understand what NRC is doing or what, and maybe regulators more generally are doing. This is the picture from, okay, I got this back. This is a picture from the performance assessment for WMAC, one of their initial results. And it shows the peak dose curve here. Here's their 1,000-year compliance period. So you're talking, 0.001 millirem within the first 1,000 years. And then the peak is only about 0.1 millirem, and it's somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000. The performance measure is up here, 25 millirem per year, all pathways dose. So what is the regulator doing? Like if you give the regulator 0.001 millirem or 0.1 millirem, why are they asking you anything, right? You should kind of wonder that. Well, here's what the regulator is doing. We're looking at the sum of all the issues, uncertainties associated with the analysis, and are they enough, in summation, to move this result up here? So that's one of the first questions we're trying to answer. Secondly, is the value reasonably correct? So quality assurance, did you make a factor of 1,000 unit conversion error somewhere in this complicated analysis? Or is there something else going on that can drastically shift the timing and magnitude? So in this case, you have a lot of margin between your standard and where you are, or here and where you are. So it would take some pretty big issues or some pretty big mistakes to move those results to where you'd be not in compliance compared to compliance. Then have the analyst supported the results. So this is kind of the overall model support for the analysis. Is it believable? And related to that, what was the scope of the analysis? Was it complete? Did you leave things out that, if you included them, would change these results in a significant manner? So this, in summary, is kind of what the regulator is doing or trying to do when we're doing this risk-informed review of an analysis that might have very low results. And ultimately, when we can answer these questions, then the regulator becomes able to discuss your results and defend them to a member of the public. And in our case, we don't have a dog in this fight, right? So whether the tanks get closed or not is not our objective. Our objective is to look at the information and see whether we can support the decision that the Department of Energy wants to make. So here's the last topic I'll talk about, addressing RAIs with model simulations. So we may ask a lot of technical questions, and they could require additional data collection. And additional data collection is expensive sometimes, right? And it can be time-consuming. So you can use model simulations, and in many cases you should. It can be a more efficient means to address these questions that are asked. The only challenge can be that one-at-a-time sensitivity analyses may only address the local significance of the issue, where we're interested in, remember, what is the global significance of all the issues, right? So uncertainties are normally not linear and additive in a performance assessment. Some of them are, depending on what thing you're talking about. Some of them aren't, okay? So here's a real simple example. I just threw together a simple performance assessment model with a source of strontium-90 released, and then it's transported through a vadose zone and then through an aquifer and creates a groundwater dose. And so then we ran a base case with nothing uncertain, a deterministic base case. And so the relative performance of that is 1, just whatever the value was. And then put uncertainty associated with other components of the assessment, starting off with inventory by itself. Well, if inventory is the mass of the uncertainty distribution associated with the inventory is centered around the deterministic base case value, then of course its ratio to the base, its mean result ratio to the base should be 1, which it is. Infiltration showed a little bit of nonlinearity, because remember, strontium-90 has a 28-year half-life, and so you can have some nonlinear effects go on with radioactive decay and transport, especially with shorter-lived isotopes. So infiltration showed a little bit of an increase over the peak dose on a relative basis. The barrier delay, this was a failure time before you started getting water to the source. It also showed an increase relative to the peak dose, and then the strontium-90. So you could come in and you analyze each one of these. Say you had these 4 issues. You analyze all 4 of them. You say to the regulator, maybe you were at, say, 20 millirem here. Or no, that wouldn't work because this wouldn't be over. Okay, let's say we're at 12 millirem. Okay, so 12 millirem, this didn't make it over 25. This didn't make it over 25. This made it 24, but it's close. This didn't make it. But in summation, all these issues combined, the uncertainties in them, is enough to drive, when you do the full uncertainty, your result possibly over what your compliance limit is. So that's the caution associated with using simulation results to address the uncertainties. Just you have to be careful, and the regulator wants to see the full picture of what the full picture of the uncertainties are. So conclusions here. We're an independent federal agency. We look solely at the merits of the materials provided. In the Hanford review, we have an enormous amount of information that we've gone through, and we're getting close to the process of generating some requests for additional information. We strive to provide clear and technically sound basis for our findings, so you understand the questions we ask, why we asked them, and then when we write up our report, why we made our decision and what it was based upon. I thank you for your time and attendance, and I'd try to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Dave. As Dave has mentioned, the NRC does play a significant role in the closure of the tank waste sites that we have several of. So thank you. Any questions for Dave at this point? Let's limit to 2 in the interest of time. Anyone?
Or 0. Paul has one. There's one over here.
Okay, so at the Hanford site, you say you're an independent agency, but don't you have a dual role as a regulator and a consultant? So how does that work? Or I guess my question is, do you ever perceive any conflicts with that?
Yeah, so the question is, at Hanford, do we have a dual role as a consultative role and a regulator? We don't have any regulatory role at Hanford. So we are regulators. We're an independent regulator. And I think the benefit of what we do, even if it might not seem as a benefit as your Pat or one of these guys that are answering our questions as you're going through the review, is ultimately we provide an independent assessment of what was done, just based on the merits of the assessment. So we don't have any biases associated with making a conclusion one way or another. And we'll perform that review similar to what we would if we did have a regulatory role. It's just ultimately when the decision is done, we don't have a hook to say, no, you're not in compliance. For instance, if NRC said, we don't agree with what you did, and we don't think you demonstrated it, DOE could say, that's fine, we think we did, we're doing it, right? So that's the difference. Whereas if we were the regulator there and we said you didn't demonstrate it, well, they wouldn't be able to do it. They would say, okay, we need to go back with you and iterate and resolve issues and all that sort of thing. So I think it's kind of the final result endpoint is different, and we don't have any oversight after we finish our review then. So we give them our review, and then they can always ask us for it, but Congress hasn't defined any role for us at Hanford like they did at Savannah River in Idaho. So.
Thank you. Any other one?
Paul,
Yes.
I think, had one.
Thanks, Dave. I thought that was a great presentation. And I think for this audience in general, it's really useful to hear that's what NRC is thinking and the way they review the PAs. And one thing to add to what you're describing up there is one of the reasons we go ultimately towards systems level modeling and probabilistic modeling of that system is that we know it's only a handful of variables that actually matter for a given endpoint. That's always the case, and the trick is to find them. So these massive models that we build lower down deterministically are useful for helping to inform and abstract into those models. But I think it's important to realize that it's only ever a few that matter. Heck, we've built some models where I know that we could turn around and say in the end, actually your dose is entirely predicted by the KD of technetium in sand.
Right, and I would agree with that, and I would even add on to that. So my experience has been that if you are, say, running a very complicated model that doesn't allow you to develop the insights and identify those 4 or 5 uncertainties that drive your result, then you've really done yourself a disservice. Because if you can identify those, these are very expensive problems. So we asked the question at Hanford, how much have you spent on cleaning the waste management area C tanks? And I think the answer was $760 million for removal of waste from the 100 and 200 series tanks there. So if there are 4 or 5 things that really influence that expenditure of $760 million, you want to know those, especially up front you want to know those. You don't want to learn after you spent the $760 million, oh, we should have been spending $5 million over here on, concrete performance, and we could have spent $100 million on waste removal, right? I mean, it requires some integration of the technical analysis with what goes on in the field. And sometimes at big projects that gets separated just because of the nature of contracts and organizations that are doing it and everything else.
So that helps explain the importance of probabilistic modeling, which I know we agree on. Beyond that, then, as you mentioned earlier, that hybrid approaches often doing deterministic modeling for compliance and probabilistic modeling for uncertainty evaluation. What's NRC's view on that ultimately?
Yeah,
How do you view compliance assessment?
Well, so originally regulations were written for a deterministic world, a black and white world with deterministic simulations, and that's still the way most of our regulations are written. But ultimately, we're trying to make decisions in an uncertain world, right? And that uncertainty piece can't be just placed off to the side. I guess if it agrees with the deterministic piece in terms of demonstrating how significant those uncertainties are, then you're okay. But where are you left if your deterministic case demonstrates compliance, but then your probabilistic case, however you interpret the results, may not? Like, where does that leave you? I think it leaves the regulator very uncomfortable, right? Because we would say, well, then the uncertainties, whatever they are, whether they're reducible or irreducible, are an essential component of the thing of what you're trying to do, of analyze this problem and make a public health and safety decision. So they can't be put off to the side and evaluated in isolation. They have to be incorporated into that decision process. Whether you separate and do two different types of analyses or not, it's still an essential part to the decision-making process.